I've been putting this video off for a few weeks now. Thankfully, the influx of news and events keeps coming, which provides me a lot more to talk about, and it gives a lot more substance to this issue. The killing of George Floyd has brought up another very heated national debate. This primarily has to do with statues and monuments. Following the many protests and riots that have swept the nation, there have been multiple incidents of statues depicting historical figures forcibly being torn down. Oftentimes, the target is implied to be a racist figure, such as Confederate soldiers and generals. Through an ordinary lens, it would seem that tearing down those statues would be perfectly fine. But statues depicting George Washington and Ulysses S. Grant have also been coming down. Both are very important and influential figures in U.S. history, and it wouldn't really make sense to have those be torn down. This whole situation, I feel, really doesn't end just at statues. Certain brands and iconography have been heavily pressured to change themselves. These icons are created with some racial stereotype and very hardly change over time. People in some respect are correct in wanting those representations changed. In this video, I'm going to be going over both the statue situation as well as the pressure to change certain brand icons, and I'll suggest what should be done about it. I recognize that history is very important. It provides humanity with the experience to make the right choices and recognize when certain actions just don't pan out. It's incredibly important to preserve as much history as we can and from as many perspectives as possible, no matter how wrong or right someone publishing their history is. We need a frame of reference when progressing in life, so having both the perspectives on the right and wrong is a good way to point us in the right direction. Regarding historical figures, I think it's important to revere people who best represent our shared culture. It is those people who have brought something very meaningful to whatever community or culture that they represent, and honoring them with some statue is a great way of respecting that. And there are some very notable and, I would argue, non-controversial examples of this. I can start with Washington, D.C. There are numerous monuments dedicated to our founding fathers and great figures in American history. The Washington Memorial, Jefferson Memorial, Benjamin Franklin National Memorial, Lincoln Memorial, Ulysses S. Grant Memorial, JFK Library, Mount Rushmore. It is those people who have built the bedrock on which we stand today. Outside of monuments dedicated to famous historical figures, there's more that we do as a society to remember our history. Certain stretches of highways are often marked as memorials for fallen warriors and public servants. Given this country's very extensive history of honoring the military, this is a very important tribute. Graveyards are another very clear example of this. We honor our dead relatives and friends by laying them to rest in a very ceremonial place, as well as putting up some monument or memorial that is very visible and can be visited to remember them by. But memorials don't even need to be that flashy in order to be memorable. I've seen many makeshift memorials honoring relatives whose lives were lost, often at the side of roads or at crosswalks. All of those memorials serve as reminders to remember our history in some way. As I said earlier, history gives us important context into what's good and what's bad. Historical figures are a very clear example of this. Not every historical figure has lived the perfect moral life. Because cultures and attitudes change over time, what would be perceived as normal and alright in their time is not necessarily accepted in our time. This needs to be remembered when talking about this issue. For example, Thomas Jefferson, he owned about 600 slaves in his lifetime. He is cited to have been a benevolent slaveholder, an oxymoron in my book, but there are very conflicting accounts in this. He was said to have treated his slaves with dignity, providing them with good shelter and holidays off, not overworking them, but again, I'm not very clear on the veracity of the claim. There is speculation that he once had intercourse with one of his slaves and freed her and her children. If we want to take all of that at face value, then it's very clear that his actions regarding slavery are absolutely reprehensible. But the thing is, we don't honor or respect him because he had slaves. We honor and respect him because he authored the Declaration of Independence. That document is one of the many philosophical and moral foundational documents in the country, and has been used as a reference for other foundational documents in many other countries. We honor and respect him because he was the third president of the United States. Lots of key events occurred under Jefferson's presidency, including the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark expeditions, the formation of Ohio and Michigan, the former of which was the first state to prohibit slavery at its inception. On top of that, Jefferson also signed the Act prohibiting importation of slaves on March 2nd, 1807. I could go on about multiple founding fathers and historical figures in the U.S. that have had their history with slavery, but I felt that Jefferson is the most clear example to pull from, given his extensive history and him being a focal point of the discussion. My point with this is to say that there's no historical figure that has lived a perfect life, and we really shouldn't expect them to be. People will make mistakes in their life, and we should be weighing that with what they did well. Especially given the historical context of people's actions, it can be difficult to paint an accurate picture of the lives lived by those people using today's environment. These people could possibly be a product of their times, and it can be difficult to pass blame entirely onto them. A lot of these figures can be said to have made the most of the situation they can, given the restrictions and attitudes of the political and cultural environments at the time. We could judge the cultural atmosphere as a whole, which might be more appropriate, but still criticize the actors who worked inside of that sphere. The smaller part of this video is meant to address certain iconography. Alongside calls to remove monuments and statues have been public pressure aimed at certain brands with depictions of problematic and racial stereotypes. This has extended a bit further to the use of certain language and terminology that can be perceived as being offensive. First off, some of the brands include Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, the Washington Redskins, Land O'Lakes Butter, and Miss Buttersworth. Land O'Lakes actually changed their branding back in April, while Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, and Miss Buttersworth are in the process of changing branding. The Washington Redskins have actually been under fire for their branding in the past, and recently companies like FedEx and Nike have been petitioning the Redskins or removing their merchandise in efforts to change their name. Because of the pressure, the team has decided to undergo a thorough review of the team's name, resulting in an official statement on dedication to the name change. Outside of food products and merchandise, there are certain depictions on television that are the cause of some ire. The Simpsons' Apu has been removed from the show, as he is depicted as a very stereotypical Indian man running a gas station. Mike Henry, the voice of Cleveland from Family Guy, has dropped his role to make way for people of color to take it up. Ghost in the Shell even received some flack for casting Scarlett Johansson instead of an Asian actress. Additionally, some terminology often used in coding practices is beginning to be replaced with more inclusive language. Twitter's engineer team are working to change terms that have negative stigma attached to them, such as whitelist, blacklist, grandfathered, and dummy value. Other companies like JP Morgan, GitHub, and LinkedIn are also looking to shift some of those terms. With all that on the table, what should be done about this? I think that there are 3 steps to follow when regarding the statues and monuments. First, people need to correctly identify which statues are properly meant to be the subject of criticism. There are a few examples that I can draw on of abolitionist statues being defaced or torn down, which are obviously not going to be the main targets of this, at least in this situation. If we want to place every historical figure into the category that's worthy of criticism, that's entirely fair, and that brings me to my second point. Assess the history of the figure. This includes going over everything that they did well against what they've done poorly. It should also be taken into consideration the culture at the time. We shouldn't be using today's standards to judge the actions of the past, mainly because peer pressure, political restraints, and cultural attitudes may have minimized the good certain figures are capable of doing. It's really easy to say that someone today would be easily able to go back into the past and advocate against things like slavery, but I don't think that's quite clear. Even if that was the case, those types of people would be in a vast minority with very little influence to actually get things done. When that review is done, it should be very easy to come to a clear conclusion on whether this figure is someone worthy of being revered and embodying our values. Lastly, if that figure is not worthy of being held as a representation of our culture and values, the proper steps would be to petition local governments or the people who put the statue up in the first place to put it somewhere else. The local communities and cultures should have more of a say of who they should respect, and as a national platform would just bring in people who are not in any way accountable to that community. I don't think that statues and monuments should be destroyed. It's a piece of history and art that can be remembered and studied for future experiences. Destroying these statues just makes us jump to conclusions. It would be a lot more appropriate for this statue to be moved to a museum or even sold in an art auction where the proceeds could go to certain social justice causes. I'm not saying it's the perfect solution, but that's one I'm setting on the table. Regarding iconography and terminology, another 3 steps exist. First is to understand the history of those icons and terms. I understand that Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's were founded on racial stereotypes like the mama and head waiter, as well as characters like Apu being used as literally a racial comic relief for the most part. Understanding where we came from gives us some guidelines of where we're heading. The second part is looking at where those depictions cause harm. While these stereotypes are offensive to some, I don't believe that they cause any real harm. The world has changed since these icons' conceptions, along with people's attitudes. People are not going to suddenly shift to becoming racists when presented with those icons, and it's pretty clear that that hasn't been the case over the time that those icons have been alive. Regarding the cartoon characters and television icons, the same holds. While he is the subject of some controversy, there are those that hold Apu to be a hero and a good guideline of what an Indian American should be. The creator of Ghost in the Shell even defended casting Scarlett Johansson for the role. The Washington Redskins have had 2 polls asked about their name in 2004 and 2016, with both saying that roughly 90% of self-reported Native Americans saying the name wasn't offensive. Those studies are rife with criticism, such as small sample sizes, questionable response rates, self-identification issues, and more, and I recognize that. On top of that, the Son of the Redskins logo designer was very sad to see it go. Aside, regarding the terminology issue, I don't believe that terms such as whitelist, blacklist, grandfathered, dummy variable, and more are portrayed as being targeted and offensive. It did shock me a bit that there is a master-slave terminology, but outside of that, I don't really find the rest of them to be problematic, mainly because the modern intent behind using those words aren't directed at hate towards groups based on race and ability. Lastly, if those depictions, icons, and terms are very harmful, it can be useful to swap them out for something a lot more appropriate. It's not my goal or anyone else's to make people uncomfortable regarding this. Most people want to treat others respectfully, and there's some icons and imagery that could possibly persist uncomfortable feelings. While this isn't the majority of cases, in my opinion, it is important to assess these things and make judgments based on what people are saying. Again, it's my contention that imagery does very little harm, but I can understand where people come from when they say it does. I definitely have a lot more to say about this issue, but I felt like this video is much more about laying out the necessity of preserving history and not jumping to conclusions. Statues, monuments, icons, terminology, especially the questionable ones, should be very carefully analyzed. We don't want to overlook something good that people have done in the past in order to harp on something bad that they did. And we certainly don't want to throw something out that has a bad history but is considered very neutral in the current time. Please let me know what you think about this. There are certain statues and icons and monuments that I haven't talked about or that I missed that I would definitely appreciate your opinion on. But outside of that, thank you very much for watching.